Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Pick Six Podcast. This is episode number 10. You can count on two hands. It's spelled T-E-N. Seems like a lifetime. It seems like it's been 14 years we've been doing this, but it's only been 10 episodes. We're going to keep talking about how many episodes we've done because why not? Because we're doing this for free, and it doesn't matter. How you doing, Drake?
Hey, DPZ. I'm doing well. Traveling once again. I'm in Elmira, New York, home of Ernie Davis, the Elmira Express. I'm actually glad to be here in really a timely manner yesterday. So I left out of Arkansas yesterday morning. I left my house at 8 a.m. and I arrived in Elmira, New York last night at 11 p.m. Eastern time. I left out of Arkansas, flew from Northwest Arkansas up to Chicago on American. And so we get ready. We board the plane to go from Chicago to Rochester, and we get ready to back up. And the pilot comes on and says, well, there's a plane behind us that broke down. So they got to wait on a tug to pull it out. So they finally got the plane moved after about 20 minutes. We back up. We start driving, get ready to take off. The pilot says, we can't take off. We have a light that came on. They're calling maintenance. And so maintenance talks to them or whatever. They can't reset it. We've got to return to the gate. We've got to deplane. We get off the plane. Like 2.5 hours go by. They finally let us board the plane. And then they said, well, the ground crew forgot to call for the fuel truck. So we got to wait in line for the fuel truck to come fuel us back up. So anyways, so the fuel truck comes. We finally depart. It's an hour and 15-minute flight from Chicago to Rochester, land in Rochester, and then it's about an hour and 45-minute drive south down here. So I was glad to be here, but it was a long travel day on Monday.
Wow. Well, at least you got there safely. It sounds like they were trying to make sure it was a safe trip for you. So I think there's a lot of trepidation when it comes to flying. They want to make sure everything's A-OK and safe for travel. Well, that sounds fun. Well, I think for this episode, we got a couple topics, but one thing we'd like to do is go back and look at some of the comments. Last episode was a fairly popular one. I think folks enjoy living vicariously through other collectors when they obtain a Grail card or an important card for their collection, and the process in which they did is very interesting and it invites a lot of conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some of these questions here, or some of these comments rather, from our last episode, Drake, and see if we can maybe respond to some of them. I saw some really good, this is actually one, Schmo 5070 says, consolidating is somewhat a relative topic since all the Manning cards that were sold to get the big boy were all bought with cash. So essentially spending a ton of money on a lot of small purchases to get trade then into a big one, to trade into a big one. I guess what I'm saying is someone with less funds would have a harder time getting a big boy to color up to without being able to pop off a ton of smaller cards first. I'd love to hear a discussion about how to get all the small cards first, so then you can pop off when that big boy comes up and then color back up. Love the episode. Thanks. Well, Shmo 5070, that's a great question, because what I usually think when it comes to this whole topic is we talk about using Card Capital. Well, Card Capital was capital at one point, right? It was actual money we spent to buy the card to become capital. Now, the idea and the hope is that you've got some equity built into those cards you can use and take advantage of to help you reach towards a card that makes more that it's a bit more expensive and maybe out of the budget for just a normal cash transaction. The problem is, recently in the last few years, unless you've had that card for 5 or 6 years or 7 years, you're probably not looking at a ton of equity. Heck, you might be looking at a loss. So sometimes it's about rolling some of that negative equity into a card that you think might appreciate over time. Now, will every card do that? I don't know. I think there's been a lot of conversations about cards as investments. Yours truly had talked about that. So is it smart to just take that negative equity and roll it into another card? Well, technically it's not negative equity. You can calculate it that way, but you're going to have to figure in the loss that you've just locked in by selling that card versus what you paid for it. I mean, you could set aside that math and go, well, this is what I truly paid for all of these cards, and this is what I sold them for to get this card at this price. Can this card make up the difference between what I spent and the loss of money, if you're on that end of the spectrum? If you're on the end of the spectrum where you actually have got some equity built into your cards, well, then it's it's a whole different conversation. I think then you're just selling and you're using that equity to color up and buy that card. You now have a card that you didn't spend a lot of money on at the time of purchase that is now appreciated in value. You can then capitalize on that, cash in on it, and turn it into another card. You got to hope that that equity that you're using will actually be meaningful into that card. And then there's I think a lot of us fall into either this category or the card where you're losing, this category where you're trying to wrap negative equity into it, or double down on the hobby, so to speak, where it's more or less a wash. And it's kind of back and forth on most of the cards, but moreover, you're sort of in the middle. I think ultimately, at least what I like to do is keep track of all the dollars and cents so that I can go, all right, here's where I'm at with my entire collection. Here's how much I've spent on everything. Here's how much I've sold everything for to get to where I'm at, factoring fees and taxes and all that. Here's my true number. Here's what my collection is worth. And here's what my collection cost me, so to speak, all in. And I'm right now around break even, if not lose money. I think fire sale, I lose money. I think if I'm patient and some of these things work out, I might be able to walk away break even. But I in no way, shape, or form feel like, oh, wow, I'm going to be a massive ROI down the road, which has made me think more about some of these may not be necessarily investments, maybe just store of value, you hope, but a collectible, something you enjoy. So that's my response to that question. I know, very long-winded, but I've thought about this a lot. Drake, what do you say?
Yeah, I think the first thing that really comes to mind in this, and I appreciate the question and the topic, Schmo 5070. But one thing to remember is I started collecting Peyton Manning back in 1998, and now there was a long break between when I was actively collecting him to when I returned to the hobby in 2019. But I was still picking up cards of his throughout and things like that. So some of the cards that I have sold and am selling, right, was into for like whatever it cost me to buy the pack of cards back then, maybe less than $5, right? So that's one thing that I'll say, and it's the fact that it's important to kind of keep track of. It's okay to hold cards for a long time, and sometimes you have to hold cards for a long time. But I'd say I'm a little bit different than other people because I always buy cards and I collect cards because I really like them. I don't look them as a if I buy this, I think it's going to double in value, or I think this is a great value and I want to buy this so I can sell it or whatever. And I hear a lot of content. I actually heard one listening on the plane yesterday, and someone was talking about how crazy it might be to have to hold a card for 6 months. And that just blows me away that, like, to some people that's a long term. And so I think, just to the question about, discussion about how to get all the small cards first. So, when the big boy comes, you can color up. I think it's important. Like, if you're really in this as a hobby, you're wanting to, get certain cards and collect cards and things like that, it's okay to buy cards and not think about what you're going to do with them, in a month or, 2 months or something like that. And I know that's hard for some people to grasp. And, the market today is different than it was 25 years ago. But one thing that I've shared before is when I brought the LeBron James 2003 SP Authentic Rookie Auto, that was under $1,000 when I bought it back in 2005. When I bought the Michael Jordan 1986 Fleer in a BGS 8.5, back 15 years ago, that was under $1,000 card. And then I was able to then use those when those did get up to a price that I was like, hey, this seems silly for me to hang on to this card because there's so many of them. I'd rather get into something that fits more my collection now, and I'd rather get into something more rare and scarce. And so then I was able to sell those cards and use the funds from those cards to then buy cards that I spoke to in the last episode that maybe it was players that I didn't care about as much that I ended up, selling for profit, or that ended up selling for a profit, or I was able to use those to buy certain Peyton Manning cards that I'd always wanted from when I was a kid. And then now I'm using those cards to then level up into this Peyton Manning exquisite. So when you look at it from a cost basis standpoint, I think it's important to look at it like that, and that, hey, in 1998, I bought a pack of cards, or my parents did, right, for $5. And then I held this card, and then I was able to sell it and then move into this other card. And then, years later, then I was was able to sell it like that. And I know that that's different, and I know it's tough for a lot of people to think on that truly long term. We live in such like a microwave society, but that's kind of what worked for me, and that would be the advice that I would give.
Well, and let me poke some holes in that and what you just said, though. I mean, I think that worked for you, but unfortunately, there's a lot of folks like myself who've had to spend a lot of money to get into some of these cars that we like because of the values that they've appreciated over the past few years. And maybe we got back in with true intentions of just maybe collecting some cool cars, looking at seeing what we have from our childhood collections, and because we haven't been collecting that whole time frame that you have. There are a lot of folks like you that have collected for a long time, and you're not, you haven't spent a lot of money to get into some of those cars. But then there's a lot of people like me who've had to, and so we have a very different feeling about all of this. Like for me, it's more down. Like I'm really into this. I love it. I'm going to keep doing it, even though it's painful. And there's a part of you kind of goes, let me just sell stuff and just walk away and just be not walk away, but go. I don't want to be too exposed. And then just move on, or go, no, I really enjoy this. This is a lot of fun. This isn't necessarily an investment, so you got to rethink about how you approach collecting. It's not so much about that versus it's about, knowing the demographic for the card you're buying and who's going to want to buy it at any given moment down the road. Is it going to appreciate because it's a more rare card? Just because it's rare doesn't mean it's valuable, unless you have set builders that are into certain cards. Like I was really taken by the PMG movement. I kind of got sucked into that, and I got a PMG, and now that thing is just going down in value. And I'm always tempted to sell it because I'm like, well, maybe I should, but then I'm like, it's a really cool card. I do like it. Do I have a sentimental attachment to it? No. So it would be a card that would move from that standpoint, but I don't know if I want to lock in another loss, especially on a card like that. Maybe over time, like you just got done saying, that card could appreciate slowly, very slowly, and even slowly enough to where maybe it comes back up to what I paid for it, which would be great. Because I didn't buy it during the hype. I bought it way at the down end, which I thought was the down end, but apparently just keeps going down. So there's a lot of people like me that are in that boat that are like, what do I do? And you're constantly re-auditing your collection, and you have spent money to get into some of these, and the smaller cards, the smaller cards you can afford now are cards that are mass produced. They're super liquid. You can sell them anytime you want. But it takes a lot of those cards to buy a bigger card. And when you are buying a bigger card, man, you have to be super mindful of, like I said, that demographic and making sure that if you ever needed to sell it for whatever reason, you're not going to be hurting to find an audience for that card. So I feel like that's the pain point for a lot of folks that are still in the hobby right now. The people that might have spent some money. Maybe there's people out there that haven't. I'm sure there are, that have been very disciplined. That's great. And if you have been, that's awesome for you. That's a wonderful thing. If you've gotten excited and bought some cards emotionally, or a lot of us do, then maybe you have some cards in your collection. You're like, gosh, I wish I hadn't picked it up at that price, right? Then you got to say, do I really want this card? Does it mean something to me? But there's a lot of people, I think, feeling that way. And I think the amount of money that's spent on, it's a whole different thing, breaking and buying all these cards, these new, like the Victor Wembanyama, the Wemby cards, any prospect for that matter. That's a little scary, and it's kind of unnerving for a lot of us to see people spending that kind of money on something like that when we've got these great cards. They're not worth as much, but there are iconic, really great cards, some of them which are very rare. They're still not reaching those cards' values. But you're looking at numbers that are baked in and values that are baked in on those players. And I think that has a lot to do with this mentality everybody has with COVID, with the boom and the boom that led us to 2021, and it kept going. So, I'm trailing here a little bit, but the point is, I think we got to really reevaluate how we look at collecting. I mean, and how we purchase our cards. So this is actually a really good question. The more we read into it, we keep peeling back the onion on it. There is a lot to be said with that question, because that question comes from a place, in my opinion, of a person going, that's awesome, you can do that, but man, I can't do that right now because I can't afford to buy some of these cards that are going to equal the amount to buy this one big card. And how in the world do you do that? Really, the only way to do that is either what I explained, or you bought it from a pack. I mean, that's awesome. I'd be really curious. I wonder if there's a way to pull. I mean, it's not really possible to pull the hobby and find out how many people actively in the hobby right now have been in the hobby for 10 plus years and have a lot of cards that they didn't sell on the run up that are still sitting in terrific equity positions.
Yep.
Or did they not sell some of those, use some of that equity to buy some bigger cards at the current prices that are much more than what they were before, right? That's that whole, hey, I could have got it at this point for this much, but I have to spend this now to get it at this price. But is it going to go back down conversation? That'd be an interesting, I'd be interested to know how many people are sitting in that situation, or how many people have had to spend, more money than they'd like to get the cards that they want.
Yep. Absolutely. Just one thing as you're talking DPZ, it came to my mind is our good friend Brett Stacking Slabs always says, turn left when the rest of the market is going right. Mm-hmm. And I see our friend Schmo, I think he's got like an Anthony Edwards profile picture or whatever. And it just it dawned on me a little bit, right now with all the basketball and playoff hype, it's like you're real tempted to like, hey, let's go buy an Anthony Edwards card, or let's go buy a Jason Tatum, or let's go buy a Wemby card, because that's what everyone's talking about. You're seeing all these big hits, and you're seeing these breakers that are opening the Bowman baseball, and they're chasing all these prospects and that sort of thing. And it's very tempting to jump in on that action. And I think where you find the most success long term, and if you're trying to find like smaller cards, is look somewhere else that people aren't talking about right now. Like maybe it's football, and maybe you've heard something that that can give you an edge, or maybe it's a non-sport or something. Like I remember back in 2020 finding out about chrome and finest gold refractors in wrestling, and that was something that I really liked. And I was buying gold refractors of Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, John Cena, like all the big names for less than $100. And no one was talking about it at the time. Now it's more mainstream, and people have kind of come into that. And so I think that's just kind of the last piece of advice is don't fall into the trap of feeling like you've got to buy what somebody's telling you to buy, because they're either selling or they've already sold their position in those cards, and you could be left holding the bag, and that can eventually prevent you from being able to get the bigger cards that you want.
Absolutely. Well said. Great question. Really great question. Another one. So before I show off this card, Mad City Collector, I had a great comment, and I want to read it. So it says, I see lots of pull and tugging collectors between owning a statement piece like the Peyton Shield Auto 101 versus a cohesive collection of cards like a set or a run of cards. If it is a hobby for us, I think it's important. I think the important point is that we need to have conversations with ourselves about what brings us the most enjoyment. I think our philosophies evolve, and we don't need to conform to what other collectors do in terms of consolidation or only collecting the GOATs as decided by the hobby mainstream. It seems like Drake is really happy with his collecting decision, and it's entertaining and interesting to see this process, even if it is different than mine. This is great. So when you hear that statement, what do you think, Drake?
Yeah, so appreciate the comment from Mad City Collector James. He's actually in some chats that I'm in and things like that. I think for me, it definitely was a pull and tug, right? He talks about like a set or a run of cards, and I mentioned last week a little bit how that was kind of my chase for a long time, was getting the whole playing year finest gold refractor run of Drew Brees and of Peyton Manning and some other runs that I've done before. But I think with the hobby, like part of the fun is the chase, right? And then once you're done with that, then you kind of lose that chase aspect. And then maybe some of those cards may not appeal to you as much as they did while you were chasing that. And so I think, his comment related to, evolving as a collector, I think that's something that I've done. And for me, really the consolidation process was one that I needed to do anyways, because I looked, and when I was sitting in my office, I had cards in the cabinet behind me. I had cards in my display case. I got cards in a safe. I've got cards in a Zion case. I've got cards in vaults. I just have cards all over the place. And I'm like, there's no way that I can realistically enjoy all of these cards. It was just from a quantity of cards, it was a lot of excess. And so, I think, it's not doing what other people are doing, but I also think it's important to talk about how, things evolve as a collector, and what may interest or what maybe interested you, or a pursuit you had a year or 2 years ago may not be the same thing that you have today. Right. So there's certain cards that maybe I'm collecting right now or looking to pick up that maybe a year or two from now are cards that I may not, want in my collection anymore for one reason or the other. So yeah, I mean, that's just kind of my process. I think, from an evolution standpoint, the consolidation thing was tough for me to even think about a couple years ago, because I just wanted a whole bunch of cards. But then when I got to a point where I wasn't able to fully enjoy all the cards that I have, I felt like it was time for me to move on.
Well said. Well said. That was a great statement too, Mad City Collector. Thank you for your engagement and great statement. Great point of view. And well said. I'm going to add to the stage now a card that I ended up coloring up to. It was a year or two ago. I got this into my collection. One hasn't sold, at least publicly, since I bought it. So the value, I have no idea what the value is. It is a $20,000 card. I sold a bunch of stuff to buy it, but it's a great card. It's a BGS 9. I was tempted to crack it out, throw it into PSA, but I'm like, what for? It doesn't matter. This type of card, it's strong subs. I'm happy with it. It's kind of an iconic card to have. I love Kobe. Only got a couple of his cards now, three or four of them. But I have two of his bigger ones, and this is one of them. And it's one that, it'd be one of the last ones I'd sell, because there are a lot of them. I could probably always replace it, but there's some crazy asking prices for some the like-graded versions of it that I likely would never spend. Their asking prices are for the sale prices from a few years back, but nonetheless, a cool card. It's an example. TJ wanted me to show off a card, so I figure I'll show this one off. It's not as cool as the Manning 1/1, because that's a very distinct card, but it is a cool, iconic card. I'm happy to have it. But I'll be honest with you. I think my Griffey collection right now is my crown jewel of my PC, and I think a lot of stuff that around it would probably go before the Griffies go. I think the Griffies would probably hang on, at least a handful of them that I likely wouldn't be able to get back, the pop ones and stuff like that. So yeah, collect your way. There's lots of different ways of doing it. I don't have anything else, brother. There's a few other, we didn't get a ton of comments there, but those are the ones that stood out to me. Anything else you want to cover before we wrap?
Yeah, I was going to say just a couple things. One thing that we really didn't touch on last week that I thought was good to touch on is, you see the card come up and you got to figure out how to pay for it, right? So kind of what are the options there and things like that. And so I just kind of wanted to speak on that process a little bit. So, as I mentioned last week, I talked to the previous owner of the Manning Exquisite Auto Shield, and he told me he was going to send it in for consignment. And I believe 2 days before it hit auction, he told me, hey, just wanted to let you know it's starting in the April PWCC premiere this Thursday. And so as soon as it hit, the premiere auction runs 2 weeks from a Thursday to the following Thursday. So for 2 weeks. So at that point, I had to start figuring out, what cards would I be willing to let go, to acquire this card. And as I mentioned last week, I started going through and developing the spreadsheet and kind of working up to certain numbers, and I ranked my cards. And I said, okay, if it ends here, here's the cards that I would have to let go to fund this price. If it ends here, here's the cards that I have to let go to fund this price. If it ends here, here's the cards. If it ends past that, I'm not buying it because it's way too expensive for me.
Getting out the truth, man.
Yes, exactly. And so I started, reaching out, and I think I've shared it before. I do consign my cards through the Wharf Sports Cards, Nick for Eric's, and he does send his to PWCC from an auction standpoint as well. But the one thing I didn't do was start selling cards before I won the card because as I mentioned before, I don't like selling cards just because, right? And I'm sure that's different from a lot of people as well too. But what I wanted to do is make sure that I had them ready to go. So if I did win, then I was ready to go. So I won the card on that Thursday night. I believe it was April the 18th is when I won it. And so at that point, you have 10 days from the time. So that would be the following Sunday to pay for the card. And so like I said, I had my cards ready to go. I discussed with Nick what the plan was. I sent the cards to him. Well, actually, let me back up a little bit. That weekend, I had a story sale, and I was able to sell quite a bit of cards through my story sale. So that gave me essentially a haircut off the top of what I had to send to Nick. And so then I saw what else I had left, what else I needed to send. I sent those to Nick. What's nice about sending those through him or through PWCC even is once those hit and PWCC determines their market value, you can then get an advance from them or from your consignor, which in this case was Nick, of 50% or more in some cases, depending on your relationship, of the value of the cards. So that instantly gave me, some more money to kind of front for the Peyton Manning. And so I would just say that, that there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? And so the cards hit auction. Some of them ended this past Sunday. I have even more cards ending this next Sunday. So I believe the day after this episode airs. So if you're looking for just a quick plug for my cards, if you're looking for any great Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, or WWE cards, check out the PWCC weekly auction that ends on Sunday. But yeah, so sent those cards, and then that gave me the funds that I needed and gave me the ability to then pay for the Peyton Manning. And so I would say just, if you're looking to acquire a big card, just look for opportunities like that, whether it's through selling cards on your own through story sales, whether it's getting advances from an auction house or through a consignor, things like that. But I think it's just important to figure out what process works the best for you and then be ready to go, right? Don't let something sneak up on you and not be prepared because you have very limited time, right? Like I said, essentially from the time the auction began till I had to pay for the card, or the last day that I was able to pay for the card, it was basically a little over 3 weeks. So not a lot of time, but certainly enough time to go through your collection and really figure out, what your plan is. Make a plan and stick to your plan. So hopefully that's helpful for everyone.
Very helpful. I hope, this discussion was interesting enough for you to pay attention to the end. We want to thank everybody for always tuning in and contributing in the comments, which is great because it gives us something to talk about. And you guys have great commentary. So it's wonderful to be able to spin off of that and have a dialogue about really probably one of the most important aspects of collecting is how to purchase, how to build your collection. And everybody does it differently, but you want to do it responsibly, right? So these are fun conversations to have, good conversations to have. Like, subscribe, all the stuff. Thanks for joining us today. Run on the nose, run the 30 minutes, get you back to your weekend. We appreciate you, Drake. We'll talk to you guys later.
All right. See you, DPZ.